Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a Q&A episode, so three different topics I want to dive into. I think they're going to be really good topics, and so looking forward to diving into this a bit more. First, before I do that, just want to go over a few ways here you can help support podcasts. So first, if you are interested in body recomp, what it is, how to do it, 10 things you need for body recomp, two types of body recomp, why it's important to focus on body composition, then my free checklist is for you. The link to that is in the show notes. Next, I'm going to open up I am putting out a course. I'm hoping sometime in fall 2025, but I want to open up a wait list. And if you're on that wait list, you'll be the first to know when it's coming. And second, you'll be able to receive a discount on the course as well too by being on that list. So if you're interested in that, the link to that is also in the show notes. So go and make sure you hop on there. So with that out of the way, let's dive into today's topic. So the first one was a question around people who had lost a lot of weight and they're lower now. Are they going to be more prone to like more water weight fluctuations? And when I first saw the question, I really don't think that's the case. But after diving into it a little bit more, I do think there is something to that. And so I want to dive into that. So first, in the short term, in terms of if we're actively dropping weight or we just recently lost a lot of weight and we're coming out of a fat loss phase after losing a lot of weight, you are going to, once you make that transition, because of the fact that you were lower carbohydrate, lower calories, probably less food in your system at any one time, you will, and then you transition to a little bit higher caloric intake, more carbohydrates, more food in your system at any one time, you may find that you see some water weight fluctuations going on during that time. So in the short term, 100%. This is a big problem I see with people. They get stuck at that place of making that transition and they get stuck because they see that weight come up and they think it's fat gain. But again, it's just normal water weight fluctuations there, right? So again, we want to make sure that we're understanding that. So in the short term, 100%, and that's going to happen for anyone there. Now, if you've lost weight and now we're talking long term, you've lost a lot of weight, but maybe you've kept your weight off, you kept it down. Are you going to be someone who is at a higher risk of larger water weight fluctuations potentially, right? Are you essentially going to have a larger response or more reactivity to some of these things that can mess with water weight changes? And it does seem like people who have lost a lot of weight remain more susceptible to larger water weight swings for months or even years after. However, we can alter this a bit, right? So obviously, the more inconsistent you are with your habits, the more likely this is going to happen. What I mean by that is obviously if you're you're yo-yoing back and forth, yes, you're going to have all those things that I just talked about there, right? That's certainly going to happen. Maybe yours are still going to be a little bit higher, and I'll talk about why that is. But I think and then same thing, maybe you have periods of time where you just have a high stress lifestyle and stress is a bit higher, whatever it may be. Again, these are going to be things that are going to acutely cause it to go up and down. So the more inconsistent you are, the larger these are probably going to be, right? For someone who has lost some weight. The more we can dial those in over time, you should be able to, like, your body won't have as big of a stress response to it, but you still may be at a little bit of a higher risk. And I'll talk about some things that may go into that. But no matter what, again, let's say you are consistent with your habits. So again, we know that the more consistent we can be long term with our habits, the less the swings are going to be, and the less likely they are to happen, right? But they still might be there a little bit. And the biggest reasons of this is so leptin, which is basically leptin is it's a hormone in the body that essentially it senses body fat within the body. Okay. And once it starts to feel like that's trending down, it's something that it's a satiety hormone, right? When it senses that there's not a lot of body fat, it will be higher, right? Because it's, hey, we don't have as much body fat, which is a storage form of energy, right, on your body in case of starvation or, again, periods of time where we didn't have food, but obviously not the case now. So it will go up. So anytime that as you get leaner, you can find that it's harder and harder to get full. You can thank leptin for that. However, what is interesting is when people are overweight, they become leptin resistant, right? So they still have high levels of leptin, but their body just becomes more resistant to it. And so that's why, again, as you get like higher and higher body fats, can be really hard to stay full, even though your body fat levels are higher, right? But when we lose body fat, again, leptin levels obviously will go down, okay? And that tends to be something that can mess with sodium retention and water retention, okay? And it can mess with stress sensitivity. So the thing with this though is I was looking this up and I was like, okay, there's certain levels that this will happen at, because again, you can make the argument that for people that are like leaner, is it level of leanness that matters, or is it relative to you? And what it sounds like is it is more relative to you. So if you were overweight and you had higher leptin levels, obviously you were sensitive to them. As they decrease, your body's going to be like, that's going to be a stress response to the body because it's like, hey, we're losing weight here. We're losing this stored energy that we need. Why is this happening? And so your body's going to be a little bit more reactive to stress in general. And you may find that there's increased sodium and water retention there, right? So the body remains in a more reactive defensive mode due to past energy restriction. So it's okay, hey, obviously to lose a lot of weight, you had to be in an energy deficit to do that, and your body's going to remember that. Okay, this happened before, so that's always there on the body. And so again, it can be just more sensitive to any changes in carbohydrate, sodium, training, stress in general. There, just for whatever reason, it tends to remember that and be like, okay, hey, we gotta let's hopefully that doesn't happen again here in the situation. So we have two things. Leptin itself can, as it lowers, and again, this is obviously absolute levels, but then also relative to you we'll see an increased sodium and water retention. And this can lead to a greater stress sensitivity. And then obviously your body is in more of a more reactive defensive mode anytime there's a stressor to it potentially. Now, obviously, to get around that, gaining body fat and getting your leptin levels higher again could be something that helps with this. But obviously, we don't want to do that in this situation there. So really, leptin seems to be the big thing at play here in terms of why somebody who is overweight may be a little bit more susceptible to larger weight, water weight fluctuations and more larger responses to any like carbohydrates changes, sodium changes, stress, high training stress, right? Things like that. Sleep as well too, right? So again, if you're someone who was overweight at some point, just understand that may be the case. Now, the problem with this is what can happen is people see these short-term weight increases from all these things, and then especially somebody in this state that's lost a lot of weight, and now it's, oh crap, I'm gaining a bunch of weight, and now they end up being in this kind of chronic low energy state, right? Oh, hey, anytime I eat carbs, I see my weight spike up. That could be it. That could be a reason right there. So super interesting stuff in terms of that as to why that may be happening. But that also leads to people thinking that, oh, hey, carbs are not good for me. I can't have carbs. I blow up. But it's just, again, you might just have a little bit more sensitivity to these things that can manipulate your water fluctuation. However, as I said, it can be modulated by consistency. Okay. Again, if we can maintain good habits, it seems to be that those fluctuations may go down. They won't be as large and they may not be as frequent or as noticeable. So a couple things I wanted to go over here on top of this though is genetics still may play a role here, right? So not only if you lost a lot of weight, we know that hey, you might be a little bit more prone to a little bit larger like weight fluctuations and weight shifts when you change things like sodium, training, when there's stress, when there's sleep, carbohydrates, etc. But there's going to be a genetic thing to this as well too, right? Some people I've just have found tend to retain water a bit more when they do certain things. Some people tend to it just is a little bit lower. Body size will play a role here on this well too, right? Obviously, the larger your body weight is, you will probably see larger fluctuations. The lower your body weight is, those numbers will probably be lower. But within that, we have all these other things that are potentially going on that could alter that number as well too. The menstrual cycle is going to influence this as well. Again, during the menstrual cycle, obviously, there can be a little bit more, there's a lot of hormonal things that are changing throughout the menstrual cycle. And this can obviously impact water weight fluctuations and whatnot within that. And then obviously, in terms of like carbohydrate metabolism, that can also change a little bit throughout the menstrual cycle, again, exacerbating some of these potential issues. So, to me, what's the takeaway here? We need to look at trends. This is why I'm a huge fan of taking weight multiple times a week. Now, again, there's pros and cons to taking body weight multiple times a week. You're more likely to potentially see those weight increases because you're just doing it more often, right? The frequency's there, so you're more likely to pick that up. But if we only weigh in, say, once every 2 weeks, it's like you may be missing out on these fluctuations, and you could think that you may just be weighing in on a day where you had a little bit more stress, a little bit more sodium, higher carbohydrate intake, and now your water weight's up or your scale weight's up 5 pounds and you think you gained 5 pounds. Now you go into a deficit and you don't really need to. It just ends up leading to this yo-yo dieting restriction over time or somebody just consistently being in a deficit when they don't need to be, right? So this is why we want to look at trends. Take multiple weigh-ins per week, take that average, see where that's trending over time from that. And so there's just going to be a little bit more noise potentially in what these numbers say. So this is why I always tell people like we can't just look at scale. We have to look at how you're feeling, clothes are fitting, measurements. Like these are all going to be things that we also want to look at, and we have to zoom out and look at longer trends there. So hopefully that all makes sense in terms of that. Hopefully that if you are someone that is in that state, you have a better idea now of, oh, okay, that makes sense. And then obviously, as I said, genetics and menstrual cycle will also influence this as well too. And then obviously, if you are having some lower carb days, higher carb days, if that's going to be something that messes with it. If we're not managing sleep or stress, that's going to be something that can impact it, right? Even training can be something that impacts that as well too. So there's a lot that goes into it, and there can potentially be a lot of noise from that perspective. All right, so second one question of the day was around fats, and can you give a minimum fat per pound of body weight, i.e. zero point 0.3 grams per pound? And so I typically don't use that. You can use that. That would be a solid number, right? So if you're 100 pounds, 0.3 grams per pound would give you about 30 grams per day. Probably a pretty solid number to go for if you need a specific number. However, when it comes to fat, I'm going to go over my dietary fat hierarchy, and then that should help you get a better idea of where we need to be with these numbers in terms of fats and what this looks like. So first, I'm going for total amount. And biggest reason, and I put this as 1A. Reason I put it as 1A is because we want to make sure we hit a minimum fat amount. Okay. So that's what I'm most concerned about is let's hit a minimum fat amount. And that's probably around 30 to 50 grams per day. Okay. So again, if you're 100 pounds, you do that 0.3, you're probably there, right? But for some people, we may be eating maybe a little bit higher fat than we need to if we go off of that. And also it is dependent on your current caloric intake and everything like that as well too. Again, I want people to hit a minimum just because again, very low fat, like under 30 grams for multiple days. If you have like a in weeks and months on end, right? If you have a couple days here and there where you're under 30, it's okay. It's not the end of the world. This is just regularly, right? You may start to run into some potential hormonal issues, poor absorption of fat soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K, and your diet just won't be as tasty, right? Again, fats can also support brain and cellular health. So again, we want to make sure that if we're not going to that amount, we could run into some issues there. So that minimum is about 30 to 50 grams. Once you hit this minimum amount, my focus goes to hitting enough protein and whatever fat amount you have per day that fits within your current caloric budget, right? Because that's going to be huge. Now, in saying that, a higher dietary fat intake, we can definitely go higher than this. It's not that we should only be at 30 to 50 grams. You can definitely go higher if it makes sense. But a higher dietary fat intake can make it harder to hit protein carbs needs, right? Because if you go super high on fats, something has to come from somewhere there, right? Or obviously you risk overeating calories if that's super high and you're not paying attention to carbs and fats either, or carbs and protein, right? Because then fats are more energy dense. And so it can be super easy to overeat them. And obviously the higher the dietary fat intake is, we're just at a higher risk of like less optimal fat sources that fit into our diet. We need to be careful with over consuming things like saturated fats and things like that within our diet. Which leads me to when it comes to my hierarchy, so 1A is total amount, and it's more so hitting that baseline there. And then obviously not making sure we consume too many fats. Sources are going to be the next big thing, right? So the type of fats we consume is just super important, right? I only put this second because you need that minimum number of fats per day. Otherwise, I probably would put this first. Types of fats we want to prioritize are mono unsaturated fats, olive oil, avocado, nuts, seeds, things like that. Omega-3s, so fish, flax, walnuts, eggs are also going to be a great source of fats as well too. And then some other sources of fats would be saturated fats. So you're looking at things like red meat, whole milk, cheese, butter. And again, these are fine and balanced, especially if they're from more of these whole foods there. So again, when it comes to fats, like from like a milk dairy perspective, maybe we're going a little bit on the lower fats ones, right? Things like that to get in the calcium that we need. And dairy is a good source of protein as well too. So just balancing it out, right? But again, with saturated fats, we just want to have in balance, right? We don't want our whole fat intake to be from all these sources, right? We want to get in some of these other sources as well too. And then obviously we want to aim to limit everything else, right? Typically fats from ultra processed type foods, trans fats. We want to avoid that, which I feel like it's hard to get that now in the diet, but we just want to avoid, or we just want to limit the amount of fats in our diet from ultra processed type foods, especially if so again, like it's not you can't have any of it. It's just we want to get more of these monounsaturated omega-3s, things like eggs, get some saturated fats, obviously, but again, we don't want that to be our entire intake. But saturated fats, especially from whole foods like red meat, milk, cheese, like butter, stuff like that, it's fine. Just again, we don't want it to be the entire intake. And then obviously we really want to limit our intake from ultra processed type foods there. Again, if that is making up all of our fat intake, we're in big trouble. And then two is going to be timing, right? So timing's really not super important. I guess there's two things I would look at from a timing perspective. Fat slows digestion, so keep higher fat meals away from training windows if you care about performance. So pre and post workout, maybe you keep fats a bit lower, and we want to prioritize more carbs and protein. Otherwise, we just want to limit high fat meals too close to bed, as this can obviously, like if it's slow to digest, that's probably going to be something that is going to mess with sleep overnight. So how do I determine fats? We're finding our total caloric intake. So that's priority number one across the board, is finding our total caloric intake, right? So whatever it needs to be, let's say for this person, it's around 2,200. Then from there, we're going to set their protein, say they're 150 pounds. Our protein's going to be around 150 grams. From there, we're going to hit that minimum of fats. Again, for that person, probably closer to 30 to 40 grams. And then from there, we're going to add extra calories to carbs, depending on what their activity levels are, fats or protein based on body comp, current phase, and what their goals are. Again, I like to use that minimum and then get their total caloric amount, hit protein, and then from there divvy up fat however we see fit from that perspective. But from there, we're really just mostly focused on I want to improve your sources of fats that you're having in your diet. And then from there, we can worry about the timing of those fats. And again, from there, we pay attention to biofeedback, performance, and results and determine what is the right intake for each client. Some do better on a little bit of a higher fat intake, while others do better on slightly lower. So personal preference plus responses are key. But the main takeaway is that once you hit your minimums, you have some flexibility with fats based on those things. And somebody may ask, well, if I want to do more keto, again, we can make that work. We just have to know what are the reasons why we're doing that. And then again, to me, it comes down to obviously in a keto diet, you're going to hit the minimum amount of fats that you need. And now it really just comes down to improving sources of fats, because that's the biggest mistake I see made with that type of diet, a really high fat diet, is a lot of it is just poor fat sources, right? Super high in saturated fats. So again, a lot of people eat like super fatty meats, bacon, pork. Again, those things are fine in moderation, but too much. Now we're running down this road of too much saturated fat and not enough of these healthier fats that we need to get in our diet. So hopefully that helps you there with fats. And then my final question of the day is around what should weight training look like in a fat loss phase? And this is something I've changed my mind on over time, right? I feel like a lot of people get this wrong. So what do people typically do in their weight training when it comes to fat loss is they do a lot of high rep work and high volumes, right? So, I just need to, now that I'm fat loss dieting, I need to just do high rep work, the burn type work. And I get it. That type of training gets you to feel like you're doing a lot and burning more fat, but you're shooting yourself in the foot here when we do that. The goal of weight training in a fat loss phase should be to provide the right stimulus, which would be to maintain muscle plus potentially add some without adding a bunch of unnecessary fatigue, so you can allocate resources to other things that will impact fat loss more. And I'm going to talk about what those are. So here's what my training looks like and what clients' training looks like during fat loss now for weight training. More focus on the 5 to 12 rep range, right? We want to stick with moderate rep ranges, which are really going to be best for maintaining or building muscle. We want to limit doing higher rep sets just to feel the burn. Personally, I like closer to 5 to 10 in a fat loss phase, but some clients prefer slightly higher. Plus, newer trainees probably need to get closer to 8 to 12 due to the skill aspect of weight training. It's probably not good to have somebody brand new push super heavy weight. Not that 5 to 8 reps is super, super heavy. We probably want to get closer to 8 to 12. And then if they have a little bit more experience, we could probably push closer to 5 to 8 more often on there. We want to keep total volume moderate. And sorry, let me go back. So the thing with high reps, if we do higher reps, is higher reps, and I'm going to hit on this a little bit, but they're generally it's more volume, right? So potentially is more fatiguing, and it's just harder to gauge your intensity as you get higher in reps. So you end up doing extra, but you're not getting closer to failure, which is ultimately that stimulus that we want to build muscle, right? And then on top of it, when you're in a deficit, one of the things that you'll see happen is higher rep sets become like you gas out before you get there. So again, you're essentially not providing the stimulus you want, but you're doing more. So you're just adding more fatigue. And in turn, that's going to fill our bucket and make it tougher to do the things that we need to do to actually lose body fat, right? Because again, if we go super high rep all the time, do a ton of high training volume, now you're fatigued, that's taking up a good part of your recovery bucket. Now we have less that we can do less that we can do and adapt to from like a cardio standpoint, nutrition standpoint, whatever it may be. And again, there's a huge, the stress load on your body is huge when it comes to fat loss. Next thing we want to do is keep total volume moderate. So about 6 to 10 sets per muscle group per week. Again, more is not always better, especially when you're eating in a deficit and recovery resources are limited. So again, it's just a thing where more volume you do, it's going to be more fatiguing. So again, we're filling up that bucket a bit more. So again, this isn't the time to blast certain muscle groups or do a bunch of volume. Save that when you're eating enough. But again, this is what most people get wrong. It's like they're not in a fat loss phase. So then now I just need to do heavier work. I'm going to train less. They don't really care about their training as much. And then when they're in a fat loss phase, it's like all things are ready to go and they're ready to just do a bunch. And that's backwards. We want to use straight sets for most work, right? You don't need any fancy training methods. I think just straight sets done close to failure is just fine. This is the time to do like a bunch of drop sets, a bunch of myo rep sets, a bunch of rest pause, a bunch of supersets, a bunch of circuits. This isn't the time for that. You need to do straight sets. Train each muscle group 2 to 3 times a week, potentially doing full body, right? So for most people in a fat loss phase, 2 to 4 times per week, weight training is more than enough. And then I found 3 times per week to be super effective. And again, a lot of people do more of the other stuff that helps in fat loss, right? Again, want to train a muscle group 2 to 3 times a week. and 2 to 4 times a week for weight training is more than enough. Probably closer to 3 to 4. I think 2 is probably not going to be as good for a lot of people, especially if you're someone who enjoys training and you have a decent amount of muscle. So I think 3 to 4, closer to 3 to 4 can be super effective there. But again, we don't need to weight train 6, 7 times a week. Now, obviously, this is dependent on goals. If you're a professional bodybuilder, you're probably going to need to do a bit more. Train within 1 to 2 reps in reserve, right? Occasionally we can go to 0 RER on isolations or machines, but we want to save our nervous system on the big stuff, right? We don't want to be going to failure, right? And honestly, in the research, 1 to 2 reps from failure tends to produce similar amounts of muscle growth, but without the cost of the fatigue that training to failure tends to produce. So essentially, we can get the same stimulus with less fatigue, which, as I talked about, is what we want to do in a fat loss phase, right? We want to reduce the amount of fatigue we're generating from our weight training. And honestly, this 1 to 2 reps away from failure, I'm going to go over one other thing on this, but this also seems to be more pronounced at rep ranges closer to 5 to 8, where you probably don't even need to get to 0 to 1 RER when we're training 5 to 8 reps. So again, if you're truly training 1 to 2 RER at 5 to 8 reps, like the load's enough to where you don't need to go to failure on it, right? You can get more than anything that you need from that 5 to 8 reps. And saying this, people are going to be like, what if you don't actually, like, how do you actually know if you're at 1 to 2 RER? Again, like the training should be hard, but you shouldn't get to the point to where you're like just absolutely grinding it up every single time. That's the best way I can say it. It should be hard. Things should slow down, but you also don't necessarily need it to be where you can't get the weight up or you struggle or it's a super like just, again, you can't even have good form to get the weight up. And again, biggest thing being more recovery resources for other things that matter more for fat loss specifically. That's really the theme of this, right? You could do smart rest pause or supersets. Again, I'll use these for time efficiency, especially on isolation movements, but don't let them turn your session into a boot camp, right? So for supersets, I like opposing muscle groups plus enough rest in between sets. For rest pause, mile rep sets, I like isolation type exercises, and then no more than like 1 to 2 exercises per workout on that. We're looking at things like arms and stuff like that, like biceps, triceps. So to sum this section up, poor weight training methods during fat loss are going to lead to worse body comp as you diet down or a tougher time actually getting into a deficit, right? Worse body comp being like we're not going to be building or maintaining our muscle as well if we have poor weight training. But then also when it comes to the tougher time actually getting into a deficit, if our fatigue is super high from the things that we're doing in weight training, that's just going to reduce the resources that you have to do the other things that really matter for fat loss. Again, as I said, this leads to the least amount of fatigue from weight training, but with the right amount of stimulus to maintain or build muscle. And this opens up the capacity to spend the rest of your resources on your cardio/conditioning, more movement in general, and focusing on recovery and nutrition. And these are the things that have more of an impact on actual fat loss, right? Like yes, I think that weight training can be supportive of fat loss. Obviously, muscle is going to be super helpful from a metabolic health standpoint. You do, and in turn, that's going to be helpful. Like the more muscle you have, you're just going to be in better metabolic health, which is going to help with fat loss in general, right? So to me, it supports it, but I don't think it's like your weight training is not going to be the main thing that drives fat loss, right? That's going to come from getting into an energy deficit, which is going to be a nutrition thing and a overall energy expenditure thing, right? Through movement and conditioning. And if we're spending a lot of our time with poor optimal weight training, that's going to dig into that. So now we can't spend as much time, or now we just have a high stressor on the body and our body is less likely to be adaptive to an energy deficit at that point. Again, a couple, like few other reasons, thoughts on this is people tend to be further away from muscular failure than they think once they get above 12 reps, even out of a deficit. And this is likely to be even more likely during a deficit because when we're in a deficit, like things just generally feel tougher. So that's why I don't like super high set reps in a fat loss phase. And because you're eating less calories, you don't have as much fuel in the tank. And this tends to impact output / how hard you can push yourself in higher rep sets. So you gas out quicker and everything just feels harder despite a lower output, right? So again, ideally in fat loss, we're doing 2 to 4 lifting sessions per week, 2 to 3 conditioning sessions, obviously managing our intensity and volume, and then a minimum of 8 to 10K steps per day there. So that is it for today's topics. Let me know if you guys have any questions on this. If you found this podcast to be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and review, that will help more people find it. And then if you haven't yet, give me a follow on Instagram, Jeff, HOEHN_. That's where I'm most active. And I'll chat with you guys next time.